if there's any possibility of our moving beyond looking at Leonardo himself today, I will get going. So we are in the early 1480s in Milan, where Leonardo is working as the court artist for Ludovico Sforza, that plum position that he applied for by stressing his capacities as a military engineer and as an architect and as a hydraulic engineer, really downplaying his painting. And then at the end saying, I can make this great monument to your father. And he was the founder of the dynasty. So it's a kind of an oblique monument to you as well. So Ludovico invited him to come to Milan, and Leonardo left a lot of unfinished work, and we don't know what kind of bad feelings behind him, and abandoned Florence for a while. But then in 1499, 1500, when Ludovico is expelled from his position in Milan, Leonardo will go back to Florence, work there for another 8 years, again leaves something unfinished because he returns to Milan. So he'll be in Milan then till, I think it's around, say, he was in Milan again from 1508 to 1513, so not such a long stay then. Then he goes down to Rome for a couple of years, where his disappointment must have been extreme because he didn't get any major commissions. He was a little bit now the grand old man, and he was kept in not especially grand quarters, and was to some degree overlooked. There seems to be that he had a little of a sort of almost a theological dispute with the Pope too. So after that, this brief and sort of unremarked period he spent in Rome, then he gets that invitation from Francis I to join the king in France, where we don't know if there were any major new commissions given to him. He continued to take work on some paintings that he took with him, which we're going to work with today. That's the Mona Lisa, and was largely interested in his scholarly scientific pursuits, which, by the way, he always considered more important than his paintings. It wasn't some kind of aw shucks or pure calculation that when he applied to the Duke of Milan, he stressed other things than his painting skill, for which he was instantly famous, but that he had the attitude that was a pervasive attitude still in his era, which was that being an artist is a lesser occupation than being an intellect, a scientist, an investigator. If we're not going to have a chorus all through this, you have to excuse me for a minute. I'll be right back. No, we will just have noise. So, and as Leonardo's trajectory of his career is that more and more of his energy goes into this mathematical researches, where he's trying to make up for all his lost education, and then his inevitable desire to understand everything about the physical world. So anyway, here we are in Milan, And I'm going to give you here more work that he did in Milan. I brought these two paintings, both two versions of it's called either the Virgin of the Rocks or the Madonna of the Rocks. And I brought them in partially because I assumed many of you have seen either one or both of them. The one on the left is in the Louvre, and the one on the right is in the London National Gallery. But I also brought them in for their intrinsic interest and what some recent scientific cleaning and research on the one in London has brought to light. So while we still have the two, I'll talk about the subject of these paintings. It was must have been really appealing one for Leonardo to take, because he could, in essence, sort of invent the imagery, because it was a new theme in religious art. And I think, oh, how could that be? Well, it was only fairly recently that the Catholic Church had begun to accept, it wasn't quite dogma yet, but accept the belief that if Jesus Christ is divine, not only can he not have a mortal birth, but Mary, his mother, could not have had a mortal birth either. And the idea then was this birth of this concept of the Immaculate Conception, which I had not understood correctly until I was doing the work on this. And that was that Mary was conceived before the world existed. She is from before the time of the Garden of Eden. So she has to be, therefore, is completely without sin. So she is the truly primeval origin. So that was the, how are you going to show that in art? Well, Leonardo combines that with an apocryphal legend, which was that when Mary, Joseph, and Jesus were returning to the Holy Land after they had fled the Herod and the Roman soldiers, on their way, they met the infant John the Baptist, who was the cousin of Jesus, and out in the desert. So they had this meeting, and that's what you have here. So here's Mary, here's the little Jesus. We'll look at some nice close-up of him. Reaching toward him in gesture, devotion, just almost longing to be with him. There's John the Baptist. And here is an angel. And I will tell you, until quite recently, I didn't understand this angel correctly. This angel is kneeling. This is the buttock. And there's a wing flaring up here in the darkness. It's hard to see. So it just, the angel's on one knee, then the other knee back here. The angel looks somewhat out toward us, points toward John the Baptist, who leans in here, and here's here. And then Mary, in a gesture, which is one evidently is part of court protocol in an introduction, is that the hand on the shoulder, introducing the person, and then here as almost like sheltering her son under her outreached hand. And there's this, a detail that gets commented on always, is this wonderful play of these three gestures right here. And then the landscape would represent the prehistoric existence. Well, this is by Leonardo. He took a while to finish it, but he wouldn't give it over to the confraternity of the Immaculate Conception that had commissioned it, because he said the amount of money that I agreed is not adequate for this work. Now, This is a big deal because up until that point, paintings were evaluated, I mentioned this before, in terms of not so much the labor, but the cost of the materials that were involved, the lapis lazuli, the gold, and not because of the artistic value, even the name of the artist necessarily. There is only just a little bit of lapis lazuli, I guess, in Mary's robe. But Leonardo said, the amounts we agreed to is insufficient for the quality of this work, for the fame of this work, because it was famous right away. And he said, I found another buyer for it. So he held it back. He didn't give it to the confraternity. And then instead painted another version of it, this one, which, as we'll look at, has various differences, some in detail, in some in a sense of sort of like the quality of the work, the underlying essence of it. That this partly is more work of his assistants. So that's the backdrop to this. Here in this somewhat washed out slide, you can see the detail a little better. He's drawing on his, very interestingly, on his knowledge of all the plants that he was studying all through here. This is a columbine. That's a symbol of Mary, because it's like a form that's pierced as her heart was pierced with grief. But many of the plants are fictional, that they combine elements of plants he knew well, and then he creates something suitable for this prehistoric world. This is a water down here. The angel is just gently supporting the Christ child, who is, after all, leaning over. It's not kind of a perilous position. Why have the water there? Well, it's partly because what John's going to do ultimately is baptize Jesus. So the theme of the water is there already. And you see the complexity, the interwoven gestures and postures that he had been working with from the beginning, because as she leans her head over toward John, her eyes are looking down toward her son. The only figure who looks out and not directly at us, unless this were fairly high up. It was part of a complex, multi-paneled altar piece in intention. There were to be angels on either side, and there was a wooden sculpture in it. So it was a very elaborate piece. But the angel is the one that sort of makes a reference to the world out where we are. There's one of those very pudgy, ideal boy babies. And the poise, look the way he crosses his legs, my goodness, and also in his face. However childlike the features are, the expression is that of the divine adult. And I'll probably bring this detail in again, but just so you're always aware of, with Leonardo and his prize of what light can do, you see the parts that are in shadow, there generally is some backlighting. So you have the definition for the form all around. And that's his drawing for the angel, where he's had some girl pose for him for that. You see, he presents out of all, just as he was doing with everything now, out of all those scrupulous studies from life, he creates something that's a vision of his own that's beyond life. And here's the other version. So the angel has a slightly different pose, and it doesn't have that hand outstretched. The paintings are almost exactly the same size. They're based on that same drawing. That was mentioned before about how that's how paintings could be transmitted. You kept the drawing, and then if anyone wanted another a copy of it, you could have that drawing and then just render it in different colors, having someone else paint it. Well, the National Gallery has cleaned it. And this is what they found underneath. So here you see the head of Mary. And she's leaning forward, her hand outstretched. It's a little bit more like, almost like that St. Jerome was, but an open, expressive gesture of adoration. Then here's the little Christ child and the angel leaning over it. Well, what happened? Pretty easy, at least, to imagine what happened. Leonardo started to create another version. In his inevitably restless way, he does something that he hadn't done before. And then he says, I'm not going to get paid for this. My pupils can carry it out according to the old design, which they then did. Some of these rock formations are like the ones along the Arno that he liked climbing among. To see this, it's almost like going back in time into just misty nothingness here. And then it's blue greens and it comes closer, then it becomes sort of a warm browns as you move in. So this is, as he was doing from the very beginning paintings I showed you, to bring her out even more, bring out whoever the figure is, there's a surround of darkness. So it projects into our space more. Now, it's true that toward the end, Leonardo more and more engulfed whatever he was showing in deep darkness, but it's almost completely lost here what the contours of the leg are. And everything here is swamped in darkness, and this in darkness. Where are those reflected lights? A little here. See, as opposed to this. Or there. It's as if the pupils, and he never had, he didn't choose pupils, it seemed, or apprentices according to their innate talent as much as to their very good looks. But whoever did this just doesn't seem to perceive how important it would be to have a little light along there, as well as on this side of the leg. But there's a nice close-up. So this is all the one in London. Then we have some, well, there are actually 3 paintings that are represent his late career. These are works that he took with him when he went to France, where he's moving off into some, maybe into himself, into some new realm. And it leaves people now sort of not knowing what to say. This is a religious figure. This is John the Baptist in the desert. Here he's wearing it's essentially almost it's a curly fur, but it looks almost like it's some fine fur. And he points up toward the heavens. But does that look like the St. John you know from religious art? Although he has the right attributes, the staff and the fur. This has such a highly charged eroticism in it. And a smile that was not conventionally associated with a religious figure. I mean, saints generally don't smile. And such a direct look out at us. What is this saying? What is this meaning? I mean, I don't have any answer for you. You see, there would be a more conventional John the Baptist. Remember when he did that this was Leonardo's part of that painting. And I do wish there wasn't a recording of what I say about this, because I need to be more discreet than I feel like being discreet. I hope this is a familiar image to you, because it was certainly in the news within the past year or so. The Salvatore Mundi, or Savior of the World, which sold for, my goodness, I think I probably have this here somewhere. More than 450 million at Christie's auction. It was discovered early this century. A lost late Leonardo. It is true that there are about more than half a dozen paintings of this precise image that come certainly from the circle around Leonardo. But the question is whether this is an original or not, if this is a Leonardo or not. And it hasn't been exhibited recently. It's now in the Middle East. It wasn't shown in the big Leonardo shows in 2019. And there's some scholars who present a lot of persuasive evidence for why this is, and some who say, I don't think it is. So it's one for you to consider. I will partly say, or even the ones who say it is by him, there are things you have to take into account. One has been it's retouched. It was damaged and it's been retouched. And it can be something that his pupils worked on, his apprentices, as well as himself. The idea of finding another Leonardo is just so wonderful. So these are, I've never seen it. Of course, I've never seen it in reality, so I'm only going on the image. But here, I think, to me, when I look at that head, there is something about the conformation of that face that looks very modern, sort of from the eyes down, the shape of the face. And someone, certainly not Leonardo, even if the rest of it's by Leonardo, did this part of the cloak, because look how mechanical and utterly dull those curves are going around there. So unlike him. And some will say that this is a wonderful hand, making the gesture of blessing that is so thoroughly a Leonardo. And to me, it's like, no, that also looks a little too photographically real rather than real and then re-envisioned. So makes me uncomfortable. But if I'm only familiar with what's a standard work that everybody knows, anything new is going to look, it's not exactly like the ones I already know. So it's hard. Don't know. We'll talk to somebody here about someone who also creates her problems. So we have the Mona Lisa. Now, first of all, for this, I will give you the dates because there's something just remarkable about the dates. It dates sometime between 1500 and 1518. Well, that is a very long period of time. In our, here we call it the Mona Lisa. In France and in Italy, it's called La Gioconda or La Gioconde. So it goes by a different name. I assume quite a few of you have seen this. And there's no way we're going to go through all the complexities of identifying who this figure is, but I will lay out some of the issues. It looks like it's meant to be a portrait of someone. It does. There's nothing in the iconography that would suggest it's a religious image. Because say a Mary, but without the presence of Jesus, does not occur very much in art. So it would be a portrait. And there is in Leonardo's own days, someone remarking on this wonderful woman's portrait he was painting. And then Vasari, that art historian from the mid-century, also said, oh, the wonderful portrait he did of Mona Lisa, and goes ahead and describes details that we cannot see in this original painting. So this may be different from what that's talking about. And then there is this, if it is a portrait, how is it that Leonardo bequeathed this to the King of France at the time he died, rather than it's going to whoever, presumably husband or whatever male it is who paid for this? And why didn't the portrait go to the person who paid? There's the possibility, one of the possibilities, that this was commissioned for one of the Medicis of a favorite mistress. And then that Medici married. And of course, his wife would not want that painting. She left it with Leonardo. And Leonardo, with his customary practice, continued to work on it and gradually transformed it so it was no longer a portrait of someone. As I say, there are various documents. Now they've found in the Prado that there's almost an exact copy of this from about that same time, so that the history is just a mystery. The painting has been cut down a little bit. Now it's not as it was with that Ginevra de Benci, so obvious and so distorting, but it was on the side. At some point it was trimmed. This little curve here and a little bit right here. The woman, we'll just call her Mona Lisa, is seated on a chair on a veranda overlooking a landscape. And so these would be the bases of the columns that held up the roof for the veranda. So she's very close to us. And she's brought up here into this contemporary secular setting with a revival of classical columns. And then looking out into a distant landscape, which is a very curious landscape in some details. There are roads and bridges of an inhabited world here. And then one curious feature, look at these rivers. This is a lake, and this is a lake, and they're at different levels. Well, actually in around where Leonardo grew up, in the mountains, he was aware part of in the Apennines. There are several lakes at different levels in the mountains, which he saw as evidence of the sort of prehistory in life, that he wasn't even following just exactly what the book of Genesis said. So he is reverting to what he knew in his childhood in this landscape. Certainly the luminous, youthful quality of Ginevra de' Benci is so very different from this. So let's go through parts of the composition. I'm again thinking if you've had art history, you will have, I assume, done this as well. So she's seated in this chair, and he's doing as he always does, turning her on her axis. Her upper body is at about 3/4 view. Well, remember that goes back to the Flemish art in the 15th century, so that was standard. But then he makes her arm cross over, all the way over to the side here. And then, rather than turning toward us, her head does and her hand does. So you've got that animating quality. And then her eyes turn in her head. And I'm sure you've been told at the museum if you've seen this, you follow her eyes and she follows you around the room. You can do that with lots of paintings. So what else does he do to aggrandize her, make her a more commanding figure? He completely integrates her with that distant landscape, however much she is right here and demanding our attention because she's looking at us and we're going to look at her. But look at how it works with the landscape. First of all, she has this cloak turned over the border here. And the curve of that on her shoulder extends into the shape of the hill, the dark hill there, or this one right into the bridge. So you have the curve of her bodice and the curve here. I have another detail, but let's maybe we'll look with this deal too. So she has a sheer veil. The one place where it seems to be sort of must be caught on her shoulder there, so it just crumples a bit. Well, where's it crumple? At the eye level. So there's a slight variation in the design that brings you again to her eyes. And where is there more light-dark contrast, which is another way to attract attention? Right here and right here. So the landscape, just a sheer washed light blue color in contrast to her veil, that brings you in again. It would not be appropriate for a living person to do as he did with the disciples at the Last Supper, which is to give them those ballooning sort of semi-classical robes to make them seem even larger. So here it is that she has the cloak with this great long curve, and then you see how that then works over here. And I have a couple of details for this. You see right here in front of you, one of the dilemmas, challenges for the Louvre, where this is, the painting hasn't been cleaned. So you have the cracks from the varnish. If you remove the varnish, the colors are not going to be quite as dark as you see them here. And who knows what else you're going to find. There you see that detail. Now there's a complete absence of outline. How do you know where the side of her nose is? Even the nostril, not there. So you see why Nat King Cole has his song, in the mouth with a smile, about which so very much has been said. There is no definition of the lips at all. In very, very subtle shifts of color, even when and if this gets cleaned, I'm sure still will survive. Remember what I said about hands portraying character? Utterly composed and at ease she is there. To let you know what an immediate sensation that whoever this is in that painting, the painting itself made on people. This is a portrait that Raphael did around 1504, 1505. He was in Florence. He was acquainted with Leonardo in Florence. And for this woman, we'll see other work done for her and for her husband. Oh, look, well, it goes back to the old Florentine clear outline and distant landscape, but look at those, look at the turn of her body, the swelling sleeves, and the place of her hands. He's taken that from Leonardo. So I want to do the other part when I talked about these superheroes and the way their work lives on. I'll give you some of the story, which some may know and some not, about the Leonardo. The painting perhaps was very well known in its own time, even though we don't know exactly who it was. But then subsequently, it just became a portrait by Leonardo. Here it is in the Louvre, in the later part of the 19th century, maybe around 1900, between two works. I think looks to me like these are followers of Rubens. I think this is a Rubens, just there. Well, it was stolen. Stolen in 1911 by a man who had been hired with several other people to create glass frames to protect their paintings. And when it was stolen, it was more than a day before anybody noticed that it was stolen. Another painter who was learning by copying another painting in this gallery brought it to the attention of a guard that was missing. And at first it was assumed, well, it was being taken so this glass would be installed, and it didn't really cause much of a clamor. The man who took this had hidden in a sort of a closet, a broom closet in the museum overnight, and he had two cronies helping with him. And they just carried it out. It was altogether about 200 pounds. And they took a train and they went to Italy. He was a Neapolitan. And for 2 years, worldwide, there was tremendous publicity about this. In France, partly because there'd been criticism about the Louvre and the cronyism and the lax way things were handled there. Oh, in fact, it was. They didn't have many guards. They didn't really watch things carefully. But all this press made the image familiar to everybody. So this is the first time Mona Lisa becomes famous. And it's the first time also her smile becomes a matter of great interest to people. And that's because of the fact that this was late 19th, early 20th century that this happened, when the attitude toward women in the public was undergoing quite a shift. A time of women seeking the vote, women's emancipation, women on the march, and that upset a lot of traditionalists. And for the first time, evidently, there's a kind of a preoccupation with women as dangerous, as temptresses, as murderesses, as unknown. And so you see how that feeds then into the Mona Lisa's, that smile, that unknown smile. I mean, what is she thinking? What is that? That's something you can't put into words about her. So I'll just give you two examples of the way this attitude toward the dangerous woman was occurring. This was a poster for a performance by Sarah Bernhardt of the play Medea from classical antiquity. And, you know, she was crazed and killed her children. So there she is, the blood dripping from her dagger and with that stare out at you. Or Edvard Munch. He did this as a painting, and then also it was sold as a print. He gave it different titles. Sometimes he called it the Madonna. So you see the swimming sperm, is presumably is the fetus down here. The languor of her pose. The dangerous, killing seductress. So that's the context. Oops. So the sequel to that is that the man who stole it, at least, he didn't turn himself in. He tried to sell the painting to the Uffizi 2 years later. And what he professed was that he thought that he would be considered a hero, that this was repatriating to Italy something that Napoleon's troops had taken. Well, of course, the Louvre is full of great works that Napoleon and his troops plundered the rest of Europe to get, but not the Mona Lisa, because the Mona Lisa had belonged to the King of France. It had been in France all along. So he was jailed for not all that long, I think maybe a year or two. So that was the end of that story. But it consolidated her fame. So look at another example. Here's Marcel Duchamp, one of the founders of the nonsense group called Dada. His early photograph of him, I understood, just so that you see what a fine-featured young man he was. And then, I hope this is a reminder for many of you, why was Duchamp, D-U-C-H-A-M-P, famous? Well, he produced works that were very witty and very provocative, as in, he immediately made his fame with this. It's a urinal turned on its side, which he then signed and dated and submitted to an exhibition in New York of independent artists, an exhibition where rather than having a juried show, which had been the standard practice, that anybody who paid the admission fee could put into the show whatever he wanted. So he went to a hardware store and got this. I say it's a work of art. It's a fine shape. I paid for it. You take it. So he begins to challenge people about what is a work of art? What is an artist? How do you judge? A very 21st century attitude. Then 2 years later, he did this one, his Mona Lisa. What he did was to buy just a cheap photo reproduction of the Mona Lisa and then doctor it. He applied a goatee and this mustache. And then you see he crudely tapes it on here and writes on it. Now I can't, you don't want me to try to say anything in French, but supposedly in French, if you say it, it sounds like she has a hot ass. So he's mocking what he said was, she's like a secular saint. Aha, well, I am going back to the original for this one other feature about that, and then I have even more. There's something about her being a portrait. If this is a portrait, she's not wearing clothing that had, it's a timeless costume. It's like a classical ancient costume. This is not clothing of the early 16th century of a wealthy woman, nor does she have any jewelry. So that doesn't seem like a portrait. And she's so bound with the landscape. It's as if she's a personification of the land. I mean, she gives the land a life. Or is she a saint? Is she Mary? Mary's never smile. So she is still an enigma. Oh, that's another one. And Duchamp also picked up on the fact of the kind of masculine quality to her face. Now, this I did not bring in. There's so much stuff. Someone did a photocopy of that head that's thought to be called Leonardo's self-portrait with the beard, the sort of magisterial elderly man said, the proportions of that face, when you hold it up against this, it's exactly the same. This is Leonardo's self-portrait. Well, I think that someone got 5 minutes of fame out of coming up with that. But Duchamp picked up on the femininity. So then let's bring her up to today, the 60s. The Kennedys, when they were in Paris in 62, Jackie Kennedy at a state dinner sat next to Andre Malraux, and she just charmed him completely. And he was at that time Minister of Culture for France. And Jackie said she would so much like the Americans to be able to enjoy the Mona Lisa. And Malraux made it possible for it to leave the Louvre and come to the US. So here it comes. It's coming into the New York Harbor here. And it was on display at the Met. Now, I wonder if any of you will have seen this in the very beginning of 63. 1 million people came in a month to see it. And then it went to Washington, D.C. for a month. There was Secret Service, military guards, police, and museum guards watching it. Since then, in the 70s, it made a brief trip to Moscow and Tokyo. No longer any travel. Well, while it was here, Andy Warhol saw it, saw its fame, and he himself did a series of 7 works based on the Mona Lisa. So, he's the pop artist, and a lot of his work does reflect on various aspects of popular culture. And he's reflecting on the reproduced, constant, instant fame of her image. Where did he get his images? He does not from looking at the original. He took one of the brochures from the Met, which had 3 photographs of it. One of the full figure, one of it close up like this, and one of the hands. And he did all of his works, which are on silkscreen, based on those 3 met reproductions of the original. This is the multicolored Mona Lisa. See there, the hands. So there's nothing he's done on this by hand. He doesn't produce a silk screen. He goes to a firm, and then another firm prints it. So he originates the idea, which is what Duchamp had done too. They're also very intellectual artists. And later he used another Leonardo as part of a series of works called Details of Renaissance Paintings. And I wonder if any of you can recognize what Leonardo there is here. Okay. That work he did when he was a pupil of the Annunciation. Well, let's take the Mona Lisa now. 30,000 people a day, pre-COVID, were coming to see it. The Louvre and the painting are both prisoners of the fame of this work. The critic for the New York Times was pretty clever about this, saying, people come to be in the proximity of fame because there's no way you can see this, nor do you see people even try to see it. They just want a photograph that they've been there. And the Louvre can't get this cleaned. Now, you see, if it were like Rembrandt's Night Watch, which is a very big painting, when that was being cleaned, the Rijksmuseum could set up a sort of a glass-walled room so the conservators could be in there working, and the museum goers could be outside seeing the conservation in progress and also seeing the original painting. And this is too small. You couldn't do it. And for something this famous, so entrenched in people's memories, in people's ideas, cleaning that and you don't know what you're going to get, that's also, you do it. This I saw someone wearing on Church Street on Monday. This was done in 2019 by a Russian firm that was doing a lot of artificial intelligence. So they showed how much you can create deep fakes, but how you could animate this. So you could bring her to life. I have to show you, look, I'm still not going to be through. I have a little more. I do want to get to a little bit Andy Warhol and the Last Supper, because I considered this important. In the last 2 years before he died, and you know that death was after an operation, Andy Warhol did over about 100 works that were based on the Last Supper. And there was an exhibition of a number of them in Milan, right across the street from Santa Maria della Grazia, from the original. And it was just called, a show was called El Cenacolo, which means the dinner. And here he was at the opening of the show. I'll give you a couple of them. This one is 60 Last Suppers. Again, it's a commentary on fame and how we grind up works of art by this kind of popularized mass consumption. This looks like sort of a lot of TV screens, just seeing it over and over and over again. Or he did, now again, he's not doing it from the original, he bases it on a reproduction from a book from the late 1880s, which was based on an engraving of the work. So it's far removed from the original. What colors are such clearly not natural colors? Or he did this whole series just on the painting, and then he takes excerpts from it. He had been commissioned to do about 20 of them by a friend of his, and then the rest he did himself. Look at this one. Be a somebody with a body. Now, that's the gesture when Jesus is pointing toward the bread. And if you think of this as the beginning of communion or the Eucharist, he said, my body is the bread. See? Here is the body. This is a bodybuilder that he often used, thought maybe to base on Sylvester Stallone, but that's not so clear. And then he combines it with popular imagery, which is a commentary on the overconsumption of this work. So you could say this is a critique of American society, but these are about 20 feet long and 10 feet high, these paintings, which is very much part of that consumerist America, we rule the world 60s parts. I am going to make sure we get through this one. So it's a fairly casual drawing rather than his being a silkscreen. And Andy produced this by hand. He was actually painting it. He said to a friend, he says, I've become a Sunday painter, because all week long he would be doing commissioned works. And on the weekend, he would do this and do this again and again. So some people have been looking at this saying, well, this just shows his commenting on the way we live in such a completely secular world, and what we have done. We make a religion out of art, and we also treat it as worth nothing more than any other commodity. However, these symbols, I think you probably know this even just in the triangle, although it says only 59 cents here. That's like from a Nabisco box, right? Up at the upper left corner. Like here's the Nabisco logo. The top of the Nabisco logo is a form like an Eastern Orthodox cross. Now, no cross here, but anyone who would be recognized in sort of the Nabisco source of this probably has that firmly implanted in their mind, that cross. Then for GE, what was the motto for GE? We bring good things to light. Christ is the light of the world. Dove, well, we know that's Dove soap, but and Dove soap, the bird rides under the word. Here, it's come over to Christ. This is a religious image. One of his good friends said what Andy did was produce religious art for a non-religious society. And it was only among his very close friends, and then after his death, that people became aware that he was very devout, that he went to Mass every week. He had a private devotional area in his apartment. He grew up with the Last Supper image in the dining room. That faith was a deep part of him. So he also is very complicated in the way he uses that. To me, that seemed like an appropriate way to end with Leonardo. You'll see more of him as we look at something by Michelangelo and other by Raphael that vie with what Leonardo does. But time is up. And of course, questions in chat, you know how I want them. I see someone's, oh no. So does anyone have any questions, want to ask? Remark? A poll taken recently, British travelers going to France said that they recounted one of their most unpleasant experiences of being there was going to see the Mona Lisa, because of these crowds where you're allowed 1 minute to stand in front of it after you snaked through these lines for hours.
Maggie, I put in the chat, we went to an exhibit at a science museum in Canada, and they had a lot of reproductions of what Da Vinci did with all kinds of things that were built so that kids could play with them. But also they had a huge exhibit on the Mona Lisa with all different pictures of X-ray visions of the Mona Lisa and how often it was changed.
Yeah,
in the X-ray.
Because if he had it for almost all those years, more than a decade, he was, so it's likely that it started out as the portrait, and then as he kept it, it just transformed. Yeah. And thank you for reminding me. I want to say that, see, I have many, many images of his drawings with all his scientific interests, which is where his later part of his life went. But you can go online, you can get all kinds of sets now. You can buy and build models of the things he's created. They're fabulous. Thank you for reminding me that. Anyone else? Do I believe the Mona Lisa is a self-portrait? No. Her hand is rather pudgy, yes, because that would show that she is well-fed and that she has never had to work. Okay. Let's see Michelangelo, the irascible loner, is different chalk and cheese from Leonardo. Goodbye.
Thank you, Maggie.
Yes.